Hello and good morning, dear friends. How are you all doing? We hope you have been studying well and taking care of your health. Welcome to task for today, TFT-13. We are studying paper 1. We have completed topics 1 to 3, which dealt with emergence, scope and research methodology of sociology. Today we will begin topic 4, which is sociological thinkers. We will be studying about the founders of sociology in this topic. The first thinker in our syllabus is Karl Marx. We assume that you have read about Marx, maybe in some news article or a magazine, but if you haven't, worry not, for we will get to know him shortly. While studying the scope of sociology, we learned about two perspectives, macro and micro perspectives. The macro perspective studied society as a whole and how its parts fit together. Marx's theory falls under this perspective. Karl Marx studied society from a conflict perspective. He was interested in the struggles or tensions in social structure. Social structure, if you remember, consists of social institutions like polity, economy, religion, law, family, and the patterns of relationships in society. Marx wanted to study this struggle in social structure to understand social change. We will study Max Weber's action theory under micro perspective. There are many ways to study conflict in a society. For example, by studying gender differences or racial discrimination. But Marx was more interested in the differences which were prevalent among people belonging to different socioeconomic status. People enjoying a higher socioeconomic status were the privileged ones, while those with lesser socioeconomic privileges were disadvantaged in many respects. This division of people on the basis of socioeconomic status is known as stratification, and each section of people belongs to a class. They either belong to the higher or the lower class depending on their status in society. Marx's concepts of historical materialism, mode of production, alienation and class struggle revolve around this development in the capitalist society. Studying class conflict was Marx's area of study. But what was this method? Marx belonged to those section of thinkers who wanted to establish sociology as a science. He was a positivist. His theory falls under the macro perspective of sociology, that is, which focused on studying society's structure. They believed that social structure influenced human action. For example, in the theory of class struggle, the economic structure was responsible for oppression of the lower class. Marx borrowed the concept of dialectics from Hegel to illustrate his conflict theory. Hegel studied the progress of society in terms of contradiction of ideas. Marx, on the other hand, believed that it was matter or material structure, that is economy, of a society which led to social change. In the evolution of ideas, the process starts from a thesis, that is an idea or statement of truth, which is opposed by an antithesis, another idea which is also true. This is followed by a synthesis of both thesis and antithesis. This becomes the thesis, and the process of dialectics goes on. Thus, dialectics describes the contradiction between two opposing forces which lead to social change and thus the advancement of society. Marx used this concept and calls it dialectic materialism to explain the progress in society. In a capitalist society, there are two distinct and opposing classes. There is an element of inequality. This forms the thesis. The opposition by the subject class or the workers represents the antithesis. Marx foresees the establishment of a communist society which would be a synthesis and thus a classless society. Thus, Marx's theory stands on the pillar of dialectic materialism. Now, Marx's method was deductive. He compared different societies to study the class structure and the nature of conflicts existing in each one of them. He studied 4 societies and developed an understanding of the economic forces at play. He was interested in a theory of social change driven by material forces. Marx defined the class structure in terms of haves and have-nots. The haves belonged to the ruling class. They owned the means of production, while the have-nots belonged to the subject class. They didn't own the means of production. They only had their labor power, which they sold in return for wages. The relationship between the haves and have-nots was of tension and struggle. The have-nots were exploited by the haves, and their labor was used to accumulate private wealth for the haves. The ruling class enjoyed power and influence on the superstructure. They had a voice in the political, legal, religious organizations of society, and through the superstructure, they asserted that they were in no way involved in any kind of exploitation. This was known as false consciousness. On the other hand, the subject class was discontent and antagonistic towards the ruling class. After selling their labor power, they had nothing in possession. The means of production which was in possession of the ruling class included the technology and machinery to produce goods. The worker was said to be a cog in the wheel, or just like a machine or a commodity which could be sold. The means of production, along with the workers' labor power, formed the forces of production. There were two kinds of relations between the two classes. One was of subordination between employer and worker, while the other was of equality between the workers. According to Marx, it is not that people produce out of material greed or the greed to accumulate wealth. The act of producing the essentials of life engages people into social relationships that may be independent of their will. These relationships are class relationships that create class struggle. So, the production process was leading to certain relationships, and this was leading to class struggle. Now, any society was built on its infrastructure or the mode of production. The infrastructure consisted of the forces of production and the relationships of or relations of production. But for a stable society, a balance was needed between the forces of production as well as the relations of production. And when this balance was disrupted, then a revolution was inevitable. For example, during the French Revolution, the old relations of production, that is the feudalism or the feudal system, gave way to a new relations of production of capitalism. This could happen because the new forces of production, that is developments in science and technology, had made feudalism redundant. Marx predicts a similar revolution in the capitalist society. The four modes of production as studied by Marx are given here. When Marx was studying the class differences in society, he realized that such differences in socio-economic conditions existed in the past too. So he studied the earlier societies. He found that the earliest society or the primitive society was a classless society. Everyone enjoyed equal statuses and the basis of relationship was kinship ties. But with time, some people started accumulating wealth and there arose a difference in status. Thus, a new kind of society came up where people belonging to higher socioeconomic status started owning slaves to do all their work. This was the slave society with two distinct classes, the slave owners and the slaves. The slaves were exploited, they were not allowed to produce any offspring. Thus, there was always a tension between the two classes. This system could not survive. With increasing wealth, the slave owners, they became owners of land. Some slaves became peasants. If you want, you can read about slavery in a book called Huckleberry Finn. Now, after this, what happened? A new economic system came up. It had two classes, the landowners and the serfs. This was the feudal system. It had the same conflicts as before due to exploitation of the lower class, which were the serfs. Serfs were forced to work more and more, and they also had to pay more land rent. The motive of the landowners was to extract more produce from the serfs. With time, scientific and industrial revolutions brought rapid industrialization in the West, and there happened French Revolution, and the feudal system was overhauled. A new economic system was established, and this was the capitalist society. Although the economic structure went through a lot of changes with different classes in different economic system, one thing was common in each society. That means 2, 3 and 4, and that was exploitation. Starting from slave society to feudalism and finally to capitalism, there was always one class or group of people which enjoyed superiority over another group of people, which was the subject class. This lower class was oppressed and forced to work hard and to sell its labor force in order to survive. Now, would there be an end to this exploitation? Was there a chance of good times for this class? Marx put forth a theory to end this exploitation. He predicted a revolution which would be known as the Proletarian Revolution by the working class. This class would overthrow the capitalist system and bring a classless society. So this revolution would be in charge of the workers. This is briefly Marx's theory of social change. Now, after the Industrial Revolution, there was rapid industrialization in the West, and people migrated to cities in search of jobs. They had to work in factories under unhygienic conditions with a less wage. Marx was a witness to the poor conditions of workers, and he wrote about labor conditions in a capitalist society. Capitalism was the new economic system which brought along with it rapid industrialization, and it was caused by the Industrial Revolution. With scientific inventions and discoveries of trade routes, nations were eager to produce more and more, and they wanted to find markets for their products. This gave rise to a new class which had the money and resources to buy machinery and labor. This was the bourgeoisie or the capitalist ownership class. Their aim was to produce goods on a large scale and to gain maximum profit. In order to achieve this, it was necessary to find cheap labor. And if they had to pay less wages to workers, they would save more and accumulate more profits. It was for this reason that they were not interested in spending much on the workers' conditions in the factories. The working class was known as the proletariat. The relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat was of inequality. The bourgeoisie was in control of the forces of production, that means the infrastructure, and it also has power and influence among the superstructure, that is the other social institutions like legal, education, political, religion. And with the help of the superstructure, it gave rise to false consciousness, and in order to convince the subject class or the proletariat that it was working for the benefit, the welfare of the wage workers and for a fair and just society. It did it to ensure stability in society, but this led to a certain condition. This was alienation. The proletariat or the working class experienced alienation. Alienation is a form of separation or detachment from four things. Firstly, from their own products which they had created but which were sold by the bourgeoisie, from their environment, their surroundings, they felt that they did not fit in, then from their workmates or family members and other people of society. Lastly, they also felt detached from their own self. They were lost. Now, the product which they had created, it seemed foreign to them. Even the consumers of the product did not recognize the production process which was involved. For them, the product had a certain value, and this was independent of the laborer. That means the value did not include the work of the effort of the workers. This was known as fetishism, which means that we are so fixated with the commodity as an object itself that we don't recognize what it really is, or the raw materials as well as the human labor which is involved. We ignore it. Another term similar to fetishism is reification. We reify commodities as if they have a life of their own. So we as consumers, we overlook the process of production, we overlook the contribution of the workers. These two terms are found in Ritzer. Please read them, fetishism and reification. Now, according to Marx, whenever conditions are ripe, revolutions occur. When one class is dissatisfied with the present relations of production and it looks forward to new relations of production, a revolution is born, giving rise to a new economic system. In this scenario, Marx was predicting a proletarian revolution. He assumed that the workers were discontent and antagonistic. So, they would become aware of the exploitation, and the working class would join together in the form of trade unions or political parties. So the class itself, which was not conscious of the exploitation, became a class for itself. That means fighting for a common cause. This class would revolt against the capitalist relations of production, and this revolution would end all kinds of classes as well as all kinds of private property, and the dictatorship of the proletariat would happen, or the working class would rule. But this dictatorship of the proletariat was only for some temporary time. They would join together in order to facilitate a stateless society and a classless society which was known as communist society. There would be a communal ownership of the means of production. They would jointly own the means of production, and as a result, there would be no more alienation of the proletariat. They would be de-alienated. Now, this theory of Marx has many criticisms. Some say that there is no possibility of a revolution because class consciousness has reduced. Also, because nowadays people of different classes, they intermingle. Many communist regimes, they have fallen, they have collapsed, and some are also adopting capitalism. Others are of the opinion that an exaggerated importance has been given to economic factors instead of ideas and culture. There is an element of economic determinism in Marx's theory. What does economic determinism mean? It means Marx saw individuals' behavior as determined by economic factors, and he neglected the free choice which was available to individuals. Other section of thinkers, they say that Marx overlooks differences between gender, ethnicity, sexuality, age, etc., and he pays too much attention on the class differences. But there are people who support him. They say that Marx's theory is not entirely an economically deterministic theory. because the economy only provides the context in which social change takes place. Also, he says the individuals and groups, they create history. Now, we have some other thinkers who follow Marxism, but they reject one or more aspects of his work. They are known as the NEO-MARXISTs. Antonio Gramsci, he says that ownership of means of production is not enough to guarantee control for the ruling class. So what extra do they require? They need to make alliances with other classes in order to attain hegemony or political domination. Also, some aspects of the superstructure, they are independent from the ruling class. Another point is that some neo-Marxists, they say that we should place more importance on the cultural and ideological factors and less on economic factors. And that's all for today. Please read the Blue Book or Haralambous and Holborn chapter on sociological theory. You have to read Marxism, and from Ritzer you will read about fetishism as well as reification. Right? You can also read about neo-Marxists. Here's the chapter on Karl Marx. For the time being, leave out IGNOU. If you want, you can read the chapter on historical materialism from IGNOU, from ESO 13, that is BA Sociology from IGNOU. Right? The next TFT will be on Durkheim. So please read and revise Marx. All the best. Study well.